Hey everyone! Just a quick reminder to subscribe and hit that like button if you're enjoying my stories. It really helps me know you're into the content. Thanks for tuning in, and let's dive right in. I should have known from the moment I stepped onto the grounds of the Mauna Kea Observatory that things wouldn't be as simple as I thought. It was my first real job as an astronomer, and I was eager to dive in, ready to make my mark on the vast, uncharted stretches of space. I had worked tirelessly through my education, and now I was finally here, one of the most renowned observatories in the world, perched high on a mountain above the clouds. The view was breathtaking. The stars felt close enough to touch, but there were rules. I don't mean the usual guidelines, like keeping the equipment clean or following the protocols for safety. No, these were different. Strange even. When I first arrived, the senior astronomers gathered us all in a small, dimly lit conference room. Their faces were worn, with lines etched deep from years of stargazing, but their eyes held something else, something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just exhaustion, there was something darker behind their gaze, as if they knew things I couldn't yet understand. "Welcome to Mauna Kea," Dr. Harris said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "We're glad to have you aboard, Helen, but before you get too comfortable, there are a few things we need to discuss." He looked at each of us in turn, his eyes lingering just a moment longer on me. I hadn't been expecting a special greeting, but I couldn't help the odd feeling creeping over me. It was as if he were sizing me up, measuring how much I could take. "There are rules here," Dr. Harris continued. "You'll learn them quickly, and I suggest you follow them without question." He paused. "For your own safety, and for the safety of others." I nodded, eager to get started. I had worked hard to be here. A few rules didn't seem like a big deal. I thought nothing of it. "First rule," Dr. Harris said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Never point the telescope to coordinates 42.67 by 97.94. Do not ask why, just don't." I furrowed my brow, exchanging a quick glance with the others. Was that it? Was there a dangerous asteroid or something out there? Dr. Harris didn't give us time to ask questions. "Second rule," he went on, as if reading my thoughts. "You'll notice certain stars flashing. Do not engage. Do not ask why. Just ignore them." Another uneasy silence fell over the room. "Flashing stars? What was that about?" "And third," he said, his gaze hardening, "avoid certain questions about past discoveries. Some things are better left unspoken." The room fell completely silent. I could feel my heartbeat quicken, but I told myself it was just the pressure of starting something new. I was here to learn, to observe, to contribute to the body of astronomical knowledge. I didn't need to worry about unexplained things. Surely, these were just quirky observatory traditions, right? Still, the unease lingered in the back of my mind. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. I spent my days familiarizing myself with the equipment and my nights scanning the skies for anything that might yield a groundbreaking discovery. There was a rhythm to it. Up in the high altitude, the air thin and cold, the silence broken only by the occasional hum of the telescope. The work was exhilarating, but there was something off about the whole place. Something I couldn't shake. The other astronomers, some of them welcoming, others distant, seemed preoccupied. Every time I mentioned something about the flashing stars, the conversation would either shift awkwardly or be cut short entirely. But I brushed it off. One night, a few weeks after I'd started, I found myself alone in the observation room. The others had gone home for the night, leaving me to continue my work. I was reviewing some data from the telescope, my fingers absent-mindedly brushing against the control panel. That's when it happened. The telescope moved. At first, I thought I'd accidentally nudged the controls, but I hadn't. I swear I hadn't. It was subtle, just a slight shift in the angle, enough for the stars I'd been observing to drift out of frame. But it wasn't supposed to move like that. The equipment was state-of-the-art, and any movement should have been a deliberate action. I checked the controls. Everything was as it should be. The system was locked in position, just as I had set it. My heart skipped a beat. Maybe it was a malfunction. It was an easy explanation, one I could convince myself was the truth. I reset the telescope, but the feeling of unease stuck with me. The air felt heavier now, as if the observatory itself were holding its breath. I tried to ignore it. I focused on the sky, my one true passion. But even as I continued my observations, something inside me kept wondering. Was it just a glitch? Or was something more strange at work here? The next night, the telescope moved again. This time, I wasn't so quick to dismiss it. I stood there watching as it shifted on its own, just a little bit, barely perceptible to the naked eye, but there nonetheless. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Something wasn't right. The rules were starting to make more sense, and I wasn't sure I liked where this was headed. But I couldn't let it go. Not yet. I had come this far to explore the stars. Something deep inside me told me I had to know the truth. The strange, unspoken rules, the odd behavior of the telescope, they were just the beginning. Something far darker was waiting for me in the night sky. The telescope had been moving by itself for a few nights in a row now. It wasn't an accident anymore, and it wasn't just a malfunction. I had checked everything, the alignment, the calibration, even the wiring. All of it was fine. But there it was. Again, shifting on its own, always just enough to make the stars drift out of focus. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I didn't know what it was yet. I wasn't even sure I wanted to know. Then one night, as I was adjusting the telescope again, I saw something in the sky that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was subtle at first, a faint cluster of stars, off to the side, blinking. At first I thought it was just the atmospheric conditions, maybe some distant satellites, or a trick of the light. But the more I watched, the more I realized it wasn't like any stars I'd ever seen. The blinking wasn't random, it followed a pattern. Regular, precise. I leaned in closer, my fingers trembling slightly as I adjusted the focus. The stars were pulsating, almost as if they were sending a message, flashing in a way I'd never seen before. The more I watched, the more I felt drawn to them. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming a little faster as I tried to make sense of it. I glanced around the room, half expecting someone to be watching me, but the observatory was empty. The others had gone home, leaving me alone in the dark. Just me, the telescope, and the flashing stars. I didn't know what to do. The rules floated in my mind, warnings from the other astronomers that I had dismissed up until now. Do not engage with the flashing stars. Do not ask questions. The words echoed in my head like a warning bell, growing louder the more I focused on the pulsating lights. But I couldn't help myself. I had to know what it was. I quickly jotted down the coordinates and made a mental note to report it. I grabbed my phone and sent a message to Dr. Harris. I'm observing a cluster of stars near coordinates 13.2, 23.74. They're flashing in an unusual pattern. Could you explain what this is? The seconds stretched into minutes as I waited for his reply, my fingers tapping nervously against the control panel. I was still staring at the stars when the response came. Helen, do not engage with them. Please follow protocol. Do not ask questions. That was it. No explanation, no reassurance. Just a cold, curt response telling me to ignore it. The rules again. I felt a mix of frustration and confusion. What was going on here? Why was everyone so secretive about something as seemingly harmless as a few stars blinking in the sky? The next day I went to my supervisor, Dr. Morgan, to report what I'd seen. He was one of the senior astronomers, a man with a reputation for being a little distant. He'd been kind enough to show me around the facility when I first arrived, but now there was something about his presence that felt almost oppressive. Dr. Morgan, I said, standing awkwardly in front of his desk. I've been observing a cluster of stars that are flashing. I'm not sure what to make of it, but it doesn't seem like a natural phenomenon. Could you help me understand what's happening? He didn't look up from the data he was reviewing. For a moment, there was silence, just the sound of the keyboard clicking under his fingers. You saw the flashing? He asked, finally glancing up at me. His eyes were tired, but there was something else behind them, something I couldn't quite place. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. Yes, the stars were blinking in a pattern. I think I can trace the sequence, but I don't know what it means. Dr. Morgan sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. Helen, I told you before, don't ask about the flashing stars. Just do your work and leave it at that. I opened my mouth to protest, but he raised a hand, silencing me. This isn't something we discuss. There's no need for you to understand it right now. The rules are there for a reason. Follow them. Do your job. His tone was final. It left no room for argument. I couldn't understand it. Why was this such a big deal? They were just stars after all, right? But that night, something happened. As I sat at the control panel, I couldn't stop thinking about those stars. The flashing had haunted me all day. The more I thought about it, the more I felt an overwhelming urge to understand it, no matter the cost. I started sneaking looks at the stars whenever I could, watching from the corner of my eye. The pattern was still there, dancing in the dark void of space. I began to record the flashes in secret, marking the times and the intensity. It was always the same, a rhythmic pulse, as if the stars themselves were trying to communicate with me. The pattern seemed too precise to be random. But the more I watched, the more uneasy I became. There was something about the way the others acted when I brought it up. Dr. Morgan wasn't the only one who acted strange. It was like a cold shiver ran through the room whenever I mentioned it. That afternoon, I ran into Dr. Harris in the hallway. I casually brought up the flashing stars, as if it were nothing out of the ordinary. "Have you seen them too?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. "The flashing stars?" He froze for a moment, and his eyes widened just enough for me to notice. The unease I'd felt earlier in his office came rushing back. He quickly composed himself, his face hardening into an unreadable expression. "Don't mention them again, Helen," he said, his voice low and cold. "I told you, don't engage with it, just forget about it." I nodded, but the warning only made me more determined. Something was wrong here, something deeper than I could understand. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it pulled me in. Something wasn't right about the flashing stars, and I couldn't rest until I figured out what they were trying to tell me. It's funny how quickly a little obsession can grow. Just indulging a curiosity that any scientist would have when faced with something unexplainable. But by the third week, I was waking up in the dead of night with one thought consuming my mind. What if those stars were trying to tell me something? I couldn't shake the feeling that the flashes weren't just random bursts of light, that they were a message. I had been looking at the pattern for so long in every spare moment that I could see it now. It wasn't chaotic or disjointed like I'd first thought. No, there was structure in it. Repetition. Rhythm. Every few seconds, a flash. Then a pause. A longer pause, and then another flash. It was like the stars were blinking in Morse code. I don't know why I didn't think of it sooner. Maybe the rules, the warnings, had kept me from seeing the obvious. But once the idea hit me, it was like a fog had lifted, and I could finally see the pattern for what it was. I pulled out my notebook and began writing it down, taking careful notes on the timing and the intensity of each flash. I had to be meticulous. Every detail mattered. I couldn't risk missing a single clue. The flashes came and went, each one a whisper in the vast emptiness of space, and I had to catch them all. I started comparing the timing with Morse code patterns, quickly finding a matching rhythm. A short flash was a dot, a longer flash a dash. It was slow at first, one flash every few minutes, so it took hours just to get through a single sequence. But as the days passed, I became more adept at recognizing the code, marking each dot and dash in my notebook, slowly piecing it together. At first, it didn't make sense. The sequence was broken, incomplete. It was like a jumbled mess of symbols that couldn't form words. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it go. There had to be something there, something more than just random starlight. The hours blurred together. I would sit in the observation room, long after everyone else had gone, staring at the sky, listening to the quiet hum of the telescope as I transcribed the flashes. My hands ached, my eyes grew tired, but I couldn't rest. The message was out there, and I had to find it. And then, one night, it clicked. I had been watching the same section of sky for hours, tracking the flashes when a new sequence emerged. The rhythm was the same, but the message was clearer this time. I began to translate it, my heart pounding as the words took shape. "We are lost. Help us. It's coming." I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I reread the words. "Help us. It's coming." What was this? Who or what was sending this message, and from where? I leaned back in the chair, feeling a cold sweat break out across my skin. A cry for help. From another civilization. A distress signal, maybe. My mind raced. Was this the discovery of a lifetime? Was this proof of extraterrestrial life? Proof of a world out there somewhere in need of rescue? But something didn't sit right with me. The message felt urgent, desperate. It wasn't like the distant signals we studied in school. This was personal. And it was chilling. I couldn't stop there. I couldn't just walk away from a message like that. I had to decode more. I was obsessed now. I spent every waking moment staring at those stars, decoding their message. It was like a puzzle that needed solving, something that couldn't be ignored. The more I decoded, the more I found. At first, it was fragments, bits and pieces of sentences that didn't seem to connect. But then one night, as I was working late into the early morning, I cracked it. I stared at the last part of the message, my eyes wide with disbelief. It is already too late. The words echoed in my mind. What did that mean? Who was this message for? I kept going, unable to tear myself away from the flashing lights in the sky, my fingers trembling as I transcribed the final part. They know. They are watching you. I felt my blood run cold as I read those words over and over. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Who were they? What did they know? And why were they watching me? I stopped breathing for a moment, the weight of what I had just uncovered sinking in. The flashing stars were no longer just a strange anomaly. They were a warning, a message from a civilization, maybe long gone, maybe still out there, I didn't know. But one thing was clear. Whoever had sent this message, they had already known. And now, so did I. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor as panic surged through me. I was alone in the observatory, just me and the night sky, but I suddenly felt like I wasn't alone at all. I wasn't sure who or what was watching me now, but I knew they were out there. I had uncovered something far darker than I ever anticipated. And now, there was no turning back. As I stared out into the vast expanse of space, the flashing stars no longer seemed like a puzzle to solve. They were a message, a warning. And I wasn't sure if I had just discovered something important, or something I wasn't supposed to understand. I looked at the clock. The others would be back in the morning, but I knew I couldn't wait that long. I had to tell someone. I had to let them know what I had found. But as I reached for my phone, I paused. The message said they were watching me. What if they were already too close? What if it was already too late? I couldn't sleep. Not after what I had decoded. I felt like the weight of the message was pressing down on me, suffocating me with every passing second. It was no longer just a cryptic pattern or an unexplained phenomenon. It was a history, a warning. And now I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I'd known, everything I had believed about the universe, was about to change forever. I didn't know where to turn. The only thing I could do was keep decoding. I needed to understand the full message. I needed to know what had happened to the civilization that had sent it, because it was clear now that whatever had befallen them was coming for us too. Over the next few days, I worked non-stop. My eyes felt heavy with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't look away from those flashing stars. I was addicted to them, desperate to learn everything they had to say. And then, little by little, it came together. The story started to unfold in fragments, like pieces of an ancient puzzle. The first parts had been about their desperate struggle, their panic as their world was torn apart. The flashes told of a civilization on the brink of collapse, as their planet was consumed by some cosmic disaster. The planet, its name long forgotten, had been dying for centuries. They had tried to escape, but no one had succeeded. They had watched as their cities crumbled, as their oceans boiled and their skies turned dark. We are lost. That was how it began, and now I understood it fully. Their civilization, their world, had been doomed from the start. They had tried to send out a signal, a call for help, but it was too late. And now, their final moments were caught in the flashing pattern I had been witnessing. A desperate attempt to reach anyone who might listen, anyone who might still have a chance to escape the same fate. But the message wasn't just about them, it was about us too. Help us. The message was a cry for help, and it seemed to be directed at any intelligent beings out there who might be able to hear it, to understand it. It was a plea from the past, a civilization lost to time and space, trying desperately to warn us about something far darker than I could comprehend. And then, the final part of the message. If you are seeing this, they already probably know about you. Those words felt like a slap to the face. They echoed in my mind, chilling me to my core. The flashing stars weren't just a record of their failure. They were a warning to us. And someone, or something, already knew about us. About me. I froze. My mind raced with the terrifying realization. What had happened to them? Whatever force had destroyed their world, whatever had wiped them out, it was coming for us too. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the flashing lights in the telescope. The message was complete, but I wasn't sure if I should feel relief or terror. I had found the truth, but at what cost? I couldn't keep this to myself. I had to tell someone. I had to tell them all. But the thought of sharing this with the other astronomers made my heart race. What would they say? Would they believe me? I wasn't sure, but I had to try. I waited until the next morning, pacing in my small office, wringing my hands together. I was torn between fear and the need for validation. I had to know what they thought. Dr. Morgan was the first to walk in, his face as unreadable as ever. I could tell he was already preoccupied with something. His eyes were distant, but when he saw me, he stopped and raised an eyebrow. "You wanted to talk?" he asked. I swallowed hard, trying to find the words. I've been decoding the flashing stars," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "I think I understand the message now. It's not just a random signal. It's a record of a civilization. Their planet was destroyed, and I faltered, trying to control the rising panic in my chest. "They're trying to warn us. I think they know about us, about me." Dr. Morgan didn't react the way I expected. There was no shock, no disbelief. In fact, there was something almost calm in the way he looked at me. "Helen," he said softly, sitting down across from me, "you're not the first to decode it." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "You're not the first to hear their message. In fact, it's been playing on a loop for years. We've known about it for as long as the observatory has been in operation. It's why the rules exist, why the flashing stars are off limits." I stared at him, unable to comprehend what he was saying. "But you knew? And no one told me? Why didn't you tell me?" Dr. Morgan's eyes softened just a little. "It's not something that's meant to be known, at least not by everyone. The message isn't just a warning, it's a record of a civilization's end. And it's something we've learned to live with." I felt a lump form in my throat. "But why? Why are we still studying it? Why are we still here?" Dr. Morgan's expression darkened. "Because we need to be prepared. We need to know what's coming." His words sent a chill through me, but I didn't have time to dwell on it. There was more. I had to know more. "Dr. Morgan, the coordinates," I whispered. "The ones we're not supposed to look at. Where do they lead?" He hesitated for a moment, and I saw the hesitation in his eyes. But then, as if making a decision, he pulled out a piece of paper from his desk and slid it toward me. "The coordinates," he said, "lead to the source, the origin of the signal, the place where this thing is coming from." I stared at the numbers. The coordinates were burned into my mind, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I didn't want to look at them. I didn't want to know. But I did. I could feel the weight of the truth settling over me. "There's nothing we can do, is there?" I asked, my voice hollow. Morgan didn't answer. Instead, he just looked at me with a weary expression, as if he had already known the answer all along. And in that moment, I realized the most terrifying truth of all. Whatever was coming, whatever had destroyed them, was coming for us next. And it was already too late to stop it. The room felt colder the moment Dr. Morgan handed me the coordinates. I had expected more resistance, more denial, but instead, he'd given me the very thing I needed to see, and yet, I wished he hadn't. The paper in my hands felt like a weight that I couldn't carry. The numbers on it burned into my mind. I stared at the coordinates. A distant star system. I had seen it before, in the maps, but I'd always been told to avoid it. It was just another distant point on the grid. But now, after everything I'd learned, I knew it was more than that. The forbidden coordinates. The origin of the signal. I set the paper down, my hands shaking slightly as I tried to focus on what Dr. Morgan had told me. "Why haven't we studied it before?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at the floor for a moment, his fingers drumming softly on the edge of the desk. It was clear he had been waiting for me to ask. "We've been watching it for decades," he said finally, his voice soft. "There's been something out there, a signal, a shift in the frequency of space itself. But we didn't know what it meant until the message came through. Now we understand. We knew something was coming. We just didn't know when." He paused, "And now we do." My mind was spinning. So they had been watching the star system for years. Quietly, secretly. They had been aware of it, but they had kept it hidden. Why? Why had they not shared this with me or anyone else? The answer felt all too clear. Because they were preparing for the event. They had been waiting, watching, and they had known it was coming. It had been coming for decades, and now it was too close. After a long silence, Dr. Morgan stood up. "We've kept this from the rest of the world, Helen," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "Because we needed time to prepare. But now we've reached the point where there is no turning back." The tension in the air was suffocating. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, and the ground was crumbling beneath me. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I had to know the truth. I had to understand what was coming. Finally, I spoke, my voice barely a whisper. "Can I see it? Can I look at the coordinates myself?" For a moment, I thought Dr. Morgan might say no. I thought he might tell me to stay away from it, to keep my distance like the others had before. But instead, he nodded slowly. "You'll need to be prepared," he said. "What you see may not be something you can unsee." The words hung in the air like a warning, but I didn't hesitate. I had already gone too far. I had already uncovered things I shouldn't have. Now, I needed to know the full extent of what we were dealing with. The observatory was eerily quiet as I walked to the telescope, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt the weight of every gaze in the room, every set of eyes watching me. The senior astronomers were all gathered around, quietly observing my every move. They knew what was coming. They had been prepared for this moment for years, but I hadn't been. The telescope's controls felt cold beneath my fingers as I adjusted the angle, slowly guiding it toward the forbidden coordinates. I couldn't help but feel a wave of dread wash over me, but I forced myself to breathe deeply and focus. I had to know. At first there was nothing, just the endless stretch of space, the familiar dark void. The stars were scattered across the sky, their light flickering faintly in the distance. It all looked so normal, too normal. I wanted to believe that nothing was wrong, that everything was just as it should be. But I knew better. Then something shifted. I didn't see it at first. It was a shadow. A small, formless, dark spot against the backdrop of stars. A shape that was so subtle, it was almost imperceptible. But as I adjusted the focus, it became clearer. The shadow grew larger, moving slowly, steadily, as though it were drifting through space. My blood ran cold. The astronomers around me fell silent. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for me to say something, to acknowledge what I was seeing. But I couldn't. I was too terrified to speak. The shadow grew larger. It wasn't like any celestial body I had ever seen. It wasn't a planet or a star, and it wasn't a comet. It was something else. Something wrong. It had no distinct shape, no defining features, just a massive dark presence that seemed to absorb the light around it. It was too large to be anything natural, and I could feel my pulse quicken as the realization set in. "It's coming." I heard someone behind me, one of the senior astronomers, mutter something under his breath, a single word that sent a chill down my spine. "It's here." I swung the telescope into a different angle, trying to get a better look, but the shadow continued to grow, moving with an eerie, unnatural speed. It was approaching us, moving toward us. There was no mistaking it. The others seemed to feel it too. The calm demeanor they had maintained for so long was beginning to crack. I saw one of them, a man who had always been stoic, his face pale with fear. His hands shook as he gripped the edge of the desk, and I could hear his breath coming faster, sharper. "It's happening," he whispered. "It's really happening." The truth hit me like a ton of bricks. The civilization that had sent the message, the civilization that had been destroyed by whatever this was, it wasn't just a story anymore. It was real. And we were about to experience the same fate. The shadow moved closer, now unmistakable. It wasn't a planet or a ship. It was something far more sinister. Something incomprehensible. Something that should not exist in the universe. And it was coming for us. The fear in the room was palpable now. The astronomers, who had been calm, collected, prepared, were no longer able to hide their panic. I watched them scramble, not knowing what to do, but knowing that whatever they had been doing for all these years, it hadn't been enough. It wasn't enough to stop this. Nothing could stop it now. I turned away from the telescope, unable to look any longer. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. All I could do was stare at the others. And then, with a voice barely above a whisper, I asked the question that had been burning in my mind since the first time I decoded that message. What is it? What are we supposed to do? But no one answered. The shadow continued to move forward, a presence in the stars that no one had ever seen before, and all I could think was that it was already too late. We were no longer just observers. We were the next targets. The room felt suffocating. The air thickened with every passing second as we all stood there frozen in collective silence. No one dared to speak. All eyes were on me, or perhaps on the telescope, on the shadow that was growing larger, closer. I leaned over the controls, my fingers trembling as I fine-tuned the telescope's focus. A part of me screamed to stop, to pull away, to leave it alone. But I couldn't. I had come this far. There was no turning back. I had to see it, even if it destroyed me. When the image came into view, my breath hitched. The shadow wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a presence, vast and incomprehensible. It twisted and writhed as if it were alive, its form defying all logic. It seemed to absorb the light around it, warping the stars into spirals of distorted brightness. It was like looking at a wound in the fabric of space itself. A gaping, festering tear that radiated malice. I felt my stomach churn as a wave of nausea overtook me. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, more primal. My body seemed to instinctively reject the sight of it, as though it wasn't meant for human eyes. I pulled back from the eyepiece, gasping, but the image was burned into my mind. I couldn't unsee it. Behind me, the other astronomers murmured in low, urgent tones. I could hear them debating, theorizing, panicking. Their calm facade had completely unraveled. Papers were scattered across desks. Monitors beeped erratically, their graphs spiking with unreadable data. And still, no one had an answer. No one had a plan. "It's aware of us," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It knows we're here." Dr. Morgan, standing stiffly near the back of the room, gave me a grim look. "We've known that for a long time," he admitted quietly. "The message you decoded, it wasn't just a warning. It was a confirmation. Whatever this thing is, it's been watching us. Waiting." My knees buckled slightly, and I grabbed the edge of the telescope for support. "You mean, there's nothing we can do?" My voice cracked on the last word, desperation creeping in. Dr. Morgan hesitated, then shook his head. "We've tried everything. Radio signals, defense strategies, simulations, but nothing works. It's not something we can fight. It's beyond us." His words settled over the room like a death sentence. The others stopped what they were doing, their faces pale and hollow. No one contradicted him. No one offered hope. Because there wasn't any. I turned back to the telescope, my hands gripping the controls so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't want to look again, but I had to. I needed to see it for myself. I needed to understand what we were up against. As I peered through the lens, the shadow seemed to shift, as if it were aware that I was watching it. My heart pounded in my chest as the formless mass began to take shape, or at least, something resembling a shape. It wasn't humanoid. It wasn't even alive in the way we understood life. It was chaos given form, a writhing void of hunger and inevitability, and it was moving faster now, accelerating toward us with a purpose that chilled me to my core. The stars around it dimmed and winked out one by one as it approached, as if the universe itself were retreating in fear. The weight of its presence pressed down on me, on all of us. It wasn't just coming for Earth. It was coming for everything. I pulled away from the telescope again, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The room was spinning. I could feel the eyes of my colleagues on me, but I couldn't look at them. I couldn't face their silent questions, their unspoken fears. Finally, someone spoke. A voice from the back of the room, trembling and unsure. "Helen, what do we do?" I turned to face them, my vision blurred with tears I hadn't realized were falling. My mouth felt dry, my throat tight. "There's nothing we can do," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. It's too late." The room fell silent again. No one argued, no one offered a solution. They all knew I was right. Slowly I turned back to the telescope one final time. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I needed to see it, to face it, even if it was the last thing I did. As I leaned over the eyepiece, the shadow filled the entire view. It was closer now, impossibly close, its chaotic form roiling and expanding like a living storm. And then, For just a moment, I thought I saw something within it, a glimpse of something even more terrible. Eyes. Countless shifting eyes that seemed to peer directly into my soul. I recoiled, stumbling back from the telescope. My colleagues rushed to steady me, but I barely noticed them. My mind was reeling, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. "There's nothing we can do, is there?" I asked, my voice hollow and broken. I looked at Dr. Morgan, my hands trembling. "This is it, this is the end." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said it all. I turned back to the telescope one last time, my body trembling with fear and resignation. I didn't want to look again, but something compelled me to. I had to see it. I had to know. As I stared into the void, my breath caught in my throat. The shadow loomed larger than ever, its form twisting and writhing as it moved closer. And then, in that final, terrible moment, I saw it. And I understood. The truth hit me like a tidal wave, crushing me under its weight. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape what I had seen, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, my mind consumed by the horrifying realization. The last thing I heard was the sound of someone whispering behind me, their voice trembling with fear. What did she see? I didn't answer. I couldn't. The darkness was here, and there was nothing we could do.